Wait, are we waiting for anyone? Everyone's here, right? Cool. Okay, without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister to begin this debate. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, so I'll start. Give me a second, I'll start my timer. Okay, begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, we live in a society where systemic discriminations have existed for generations that have placed people across different socioeconomic statuses. We also live in a society where different people have, across different social economic statuses, based on that, people have access to different sets of resources, which continues the cycle of socioeconomic classes where poor people aren't able to elevate themselves out of poverty. So that is why we are proud to propose. So in my speech, I'm going to talk about firstly the clarification, secondly how we mechanize it, and thirdly in the arguments I'll tell you why this will actually disincentivize class-based discrimination and the impacts of it. So the first part, what do we clarify? For the purposes of this debate, we understand that socioeconomic status implies that there's a hierarchy based on incomes, which means that these people who are at the top of the socioeconomic statuses have better access to resources such as education, social protection, or healthcare, right? And oftentimes in multiracial society, this looks like people of like being a privileged race enjoys from like being at the higher at a place of power in the socioeconomic statuses. And also like people of minority races often face discrimination and which causes them to be in a lower socioeconomic status, right? This could look like in the US where African Americans generally constitute the poorer neighborhoods and they are obviously account for a much greater amount of the lower income families than white, as opposed to their white counterparts, right? For the purposes of this debate, how do we exactly mechanize it? We understand that the government has the data of people's social economic background from the tax statement. So the government can assign a few poor people to middle income neighborhood and vice versa. For the feasibility of this like motion, we understand that it is not a problem because the motion assumes that it is possible, meaning that the government will make it happen and move people to the houses and have subsidies, right? So what changes is that their income shouldn't change and should for the purposes of this motion, that is what this motion implies, and this shouldn't be at the expense because that is what this debate is not about. So the stakeholders for this debate is that disadvantaged groups are individuals who don't have access to resources, and oftentimes, as I told you earlier, these are racial minorities who are in the position in the first place due to systematic oppression, right? And the stakeholders are also high income individuals who benefit from being upper middle classes, right? So the trade-off for this debate is that upper middle classes comfort and security of their life for the large population of people who are living wage to wage, stuck in poverty cycles, right? So this debate is about which side better able to reduce discrimination and ensures more equal allocations of resources and in order to elevate poverty. What this debate is not about is the feasibility, because the motion assumes that it is feasible. And for the burden for us to prove is that how fairly redistributing population would actually will actually ultimately minimize disparity. And the ideal world we imagine and the outcome we imagine is a minimized disparity, right? So moving on to the argument, what do we tell you? We tell you that this will actually disincentivize class-based structural discrimination. Why is this necessarily true? This is true because understand that the current systems that exist, for example, in the US or many other countries, this allocates funds and taxes to richer neighborhoods where they have more significantly higher number of tax-paying individuals, right? Which means that richer people living in these richer neighborhoods enjoy from better resources, which looks like better public schools, better public hospitals, better facilities. So understand that a redistribution is required. Because why is it required? Because a redistribution would actually inherently reduce discrimination in two ways. Number one, tax allocations will now be more equal all across the neighborhood, which means that every neighborhood would equally benefit from better resources such as education and healthcare and etc. Secondly, while allocating funds and etc., the government officials are less likely going to be discriminatory, given the fact that all the societies have an equal proportion of all social classes. So there's no question of which society has a higher places better in the hierarchy, right? Secondly, why is this important? Because we define that how poorer social classes are disadvantaged, right? We told you like how systematic discrimination place these individuals in the vulnerable position in the first place. We also told you there's a lack of accessibility to these resources. For example, like a kid living in a poor neighborhood would find it extremely difficult to actually do well in their school and to actually get a better paying job and to actually move out of the cycle that the system placed these individuals in the first place. So it makes it even harder for them to get out of their situations. And in multiracial societies, as I defined earlier, poverty is more evident among certain races, right? For example, in the African American community, they're in a position of disadvantage, which actually further exacerbates like racism and further exacerbates structural discrimination. Like in structural discrimination in the past, for example, Jim Crow's laws, where African Americans in separate societies and cause them to be in these positions in the first place. So the government policies place them in the first place, right? So we can see the fact that government systems and the failures and the loopholes in the legislation actually resulted in this discrimination. We believe that principally government owes them to ensure that they can actually get out of these cycles, right? They can actually elevate themselves out of poverty. So the impact is that what do the impacts actually look like? So for example, a government incentive, right? So the government incentive, government is actually accountable for the type of schools people are actually allocated. We can see that when there's more distribution and more distribution of people across different neighborhoods, more schools would actually have better funding, right? Especially neighborhoods which were prior to this constituted mostly of the poor individuals, right? Which means these schools would have better teachers and better individuals who are better able to help these kids ensure a better future, right? Also understand the hospitals. Public hospitals in poor neighborhoods now would have more funding. Which means poor individuals prior to this who were just being discriminated against would now have better access to healthcare. Also understand the work opportunities, right? Which is extremely important when more diverse income group settles in one neighborhood and more likely bosses and high executive are likely going to ensure that this happens, right? So also government has now more incentive to redirect the tax money equally because they will be held accountable. Why is it likely? Because understand that people in positions of power who were reallocated to these less established neighborhoods will complain and they have the power to enforce the government and enact these changes. So what is the comparative under the opposition side of the world? We can see the current policies due to discrimination. Several groups are being disadvantaged and are being stuck in the cycles. It has also exacerbated racism, as I mentioned earlier, and which portrays, for example, African Americans being thugs or Latino Americans being associated with drug cartels. Due to the nature of this class-based discrimination, it is impossible for them to get out of the cycle. In conclusion, we are able to reduce class-based discrimination, and that is why I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite Leader of Opposition to begin the case for side opposition. Here.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. For far too long, neighborhoods have been segregated based on socioeconomic stature. We think that the long history of this happening means that understanding isn't simply based on geographical locations. Just because you force reintegration through putting them in the same neighborhoods doesn't mean they live the same lives. You will not have poor individuals going to the large, rich charter schools. You don't have the rich accessing the same amount of goods. You don't have them accessing the same quality of lives just because you shove them into the same neighborhoods. We think that's a squirrel of this debate. What did Gov actually need to defend? Because recognize that their policy was very convenient in saying that pushing them to the same neighborhoods would mean they have the same access to things like the access to things like resources. We don't think that is true. This debate has to take place in a world where you just reallocate these individuals' geographical positions rather than all the resources. We tell you that the redistribution of resources becomes significantly worse in these worlds, and that's not something that we want. The policy in this debate and the thing that Gov needed to defend is a world where they eliminated neighborhood segregation by putting different socioeconomic groups in the same place. They do not have fiat power to assume that they're going to all have the same quality of life, to have all the same homes, all the same schools. We don't think that is something that's sustainable, because recognize that the policy in this debate is moving individuals to the same neighborhoods. This doesn't mean that you're going to allocate things like more subsidies into these neighborhoods, for example. And we argue that the amount of subsidies that you get is actually actually worse, because when you don't target your resources to specific poor neighborhoods like you do have in status quo, that reduces your capacity to allocate resources effectively. We think that's a harm. Before I even get to my argumentation, what Gov needed to argue and what they needed to answer is why are all the homes going to be same? Are the rich going to have to poor things like taxes and the poor don't? These are questions that needs to be answered in order to talk about things like empathy, to talk about things like allocation of resources. Without that, side government cannot stand. What are the two arguments I'm going to present to you today in this debate? I think first, there's a principal injustice in telling these individuals that their only problems are geographical and that's the only reason that they're within these environments in the first place. And second, on a more pragmatic level, I'll explain to you why recognize that the only Gov arguments were that there's going to be trickle-down economics, that you can provide some form of benefits toward these people. I'll prove to you why this doesn't happen on two levels. The first, on principle, and why this policy is one that is harmful. First, I think there's going to be an expectation of redistribution onto private citizens. That means to say that the state is going to tell their middle class and upper citizens that the way that they should provide for their poor neighborhoods is by giving cheaper wages, by doing things like living within the same neighborhoods and sharing your resources. This puts an expectations of redistribution on private citizens, which is a principal injustice, considering that the state's obligation is to do this. It is not a private citizen's duty to provide for the poor, in which case the states have systematically screwed over the poor. It is their duty to fix this error, not a private citizen. Secondly, the reason why this is a principal harm is because govs don't actually match the needs of the poor into the neighborhoods that exist now. Because recognize that when you split them all up into different neighborhoods, that's when there's a lesser amount of capacity for govs to specifically target their policies. They don't match the needs of the poor. That's a harm in principle. Yes, I'll take POI.
Yeah. Why would there exactly be an expectation of redistribution in the first place? I don't understand why government would suddenly force rich people to take lesser wages, and why would that even happen?
Okay. When you put individuals within the same neighborhood and you tell them that this is the solution to curing things like poverty, that is when there's an expectation that your neighbors are the result, the neighbors are your origin of your poverty. That's when there's an obligation for these, that's when there's a imposed obligation for your neighbors to be the one to correct your socioeconomic position, not the state. Don't get what that POI was for. But why is the pragmatic extension of this harm something that makes redistribution inherently worse? Because recognize firstly that the socioeconomic statuses of these individuals was directly responsible by states. Things like poor city planning, low scholarships afforded, and poor geographical mobility are all inherent faults of the states and failures of the state to provide for mobility to move up within the social ladder. That's why you have extremely poor neighborhoods that do not get fixed when the states don't intervene. What happens then is that when there's a reliance on neighborhoods to provide things like welfare, we think that is bad because you scapegoat the duty onto private citizens. The outcome is you blame the origins of poverty onto the interactions of the private citizens rather than the state's welfare. If welfare is shit, you push for the neighbors to provide for welfare. We think that is harm. But on a second layer, subjective problems like being told that you're lazy or discrimination and stigma become the prime source of your harm, and there's never a recognition of structural barriers like inaccessibility to labor markets, for example. I think that's a harm that you do not alleviate and you do not recognize if you simply push individuals into the same neighborhoods. The outcome of this is that redistribution policies become significantly worse because there's a lesser incentive for states because of all the reasons I gave you earlier. But secondly, the states lose the opportunity to concentrate resources onto certain geographical positions. That's why there's such a large disparity between things like megacities and rural areas. And when you lose out the capacity to concentrate things like welfare centers onto the poor, that's when it becomes significantly harder for individuals of this socioeconomic status to gain help in the very first place. We think what this means is that you put the harm on the poor to travel further to gain their resources, or in a lot of instances, they lose out on this resource in the very first place. We think what this means is that they directly lose out the benefits that Gav wanted to talk about. But on a second layer, we think that when you gentrify the neighborhoods, when you put different like I think in status quo, different places having different costs of living are adjusted based on the market to reflect living conditions of an average citizen. But when you push them all together, it means that the cost of living becomes based on the median. It looks like things like businesses only catering towards the extreme wealth within a neighborhood, or at least the middle class citizens within there. That's when there's never an allowance for the poorer, like individuals, like businesses we see penetrating like low income neighborhoods, for example. And secondly, there's just a net loss of resources for these individuals. When you do that, the three outcomes that happen. I think firstly, an inequitable distribution of resources means that you concentrate the resources onto the powerful, onto those with political power. And when you have less visceral reminders by removing slum neighborhoods, that's when you don't get an equitable redistribution of income. But secondly, you emphasize the distribution on resources on things that the poor don't need, things like providing parks instead of jobs. When you do not clarify the needs of these neighborhoods, that's when you lose out on resources the most. But lastly, right, when you push these individuals to the same neighborhoods, these individuals are still going to have very different living conditions. When your poor neighbor sees that your rich is spending so much money and living so lavishly, we think the quality of life goes significantly down because you lose out on the ability to feel safe in your neighborhoods. You lose out the ability to have allyship within your very poor neighborhoods. We think all this means is that the redistribution of income becomes significantly worse and the quality of life goes down. Never be proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for sides government. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Setting my timer for a sec. Starting in 3, 2, 1. We do recognize that hierarchy is a given, and even if we put like people from different socioeconomic backgrounds in the same place, there would still be hierarchy, right? But at the very least, what we're trying to fight for in our world is better allocation of resources, hence better chances for all individuals to get out of their poverty cycles and get the opportunity to access the amenities that they deserve, right? The reason why this is true, firstly, I will explain two rebuttals, and then I'll continue proving my point on how this the positive impacts on the nature of neighborhoods in our world, as well as the likelihood of redistribution of wealth to happen in our world. So firstly, let's talk about allocation of resources and the rebuttals, right? They've talked about how, allocation of resources will not be better in our world because of, I don't know, they stated about how this is just a geographical relocation instead of the relocation of resources, right? Understand that in status quo, the allocation of taxpayers' money often goes back to neighborhoods with members paying the most taxes, right? This is not just a geographical relocation, because the definition of low income or high income neighborhoods does not depend on the geographical location only. It depends on the saturation of individuals who lives in those areas, be it they are poor or they are rich, right? The reason why the government have the incentive to give poor allocation of taxpayers' money in the first place, right? Because number two, expectation towards they've talked about how expectation towards neighbors, the blame would be shifted towards the neighbors instead of the state to help these individuals, right? We tell you that minimizing the power of high income individuals that is rooted from their saturation living in the same place is a governmental effort to minimize disparity, and a very important effort at that, because rich neighborhoods create a leeway for the rich individuals to be above the law because they have the resources to access the government better, right? They have better negotiating power, and this can't be solved unless you break them up. So in our world, at the very least, all neighborhoods will get the same negotiating power with the government, and they would get like better allocation of resources. Two things that I have proven. Relocating these individuals is not just the geographical relocation, it is the relocation of resources, as well as how the entire point of how the expectation of neighbors going to help the individuals instead of the state is not true and will not materialize in our world, because the state would be better held accountable in our world, right? Moving on to my argument, how this would positively impact the nature of these neighborhoods, right? Two sub-points: A, how they would get better access to amenities, and B, how neighborhood safety will be better ensured in our world. So first thing first, let's talk about access to amenities. I might have already told you about this neighborhood will be ensured to have better schools, better hospitals, better Wi-Fi, and all kinds of amenities that would help them get out of their poverty cycle and like lead better lives, right? Why do we think that this is necessarily true? We have already told you that the government is incentivized to only to relocate their taxpayers' money back to the people who pays the most taxes, right? So if these neighborhoods cannot be recognized as a high income or a low income neighborhood, the government must be held accountable, can be held accountable better, as they do not have any reason to give like any sort of structural discrimination towards any of this neighborhood, because they now cannot recognize if these neighborhood are high income or of a low income, right? B, there is a less likelihood of targeted geographic discrimination, where the government targets to profit off of of people in poor neighborhoods, right? For example, targeted advertising, for example, putting lottery advertisements being put in poor neighborhoods simply due to the and like trying to exploit off of them, because they're the ones who need easy money, which is why the government would want to profit off of them by using by advertising lottery in their neighborhood, right? These kinds of things would less likely going to occur in our world, simply due to the fact that you can no longer recognize if a neighborhood is of a high income or a low income. So there's less likelihood of structural discrimination, depriving individuals of opportunities to break out of the poverty cycle, giving them the chance to go to school, get quality education, and get access of jobs, and help their families work out of their poverty cycles, right? And these benefits could only be garnered once the government recognized that none of these neighborhoods are rich or poor. Second sub point on how neighborhood safety would be better ensured and less discriminatory in our world. Firstly, having access to a safe neighborhood is extremely essential. It gives your kids the autonomy to play outside without any threats. That is something that's very important, right? And you get to like go out of your house and go to work without like any sort of like threat of being mugged or something like that. But understand that most low-income areas are very high in crime rates due to some reasons, right? Because the problem in status quo is that security can only be afforded in rich neighborhood areas, and B, police forces or the authority tends to be less efficient in low-income areas because they are underfunded. The reason why low-income areas become the areas with high crime, there are other reasons why low-income areas become areas with high crime rates as well, because A, most of them have to commit desperate crimes to get money, which most of them have to commit desperate crimes to get money, and B, they also if their family got involved in crimes beforehand, they would not know how else to get money and so on and so forth, right? They could not like just easily break out of the cycle that their families have created. So the police force and B, the police force deployed in their areas are oftentimes underfunded, so they could not cancel out or minimize the impacts of these desperate crimes that you can't help but happen, right? So the impact here is racial profiling neighborhoods. The impact of racially profiling neighborhoods amplifies police brutality as well as inherent racism. How is this likely to change in our world? We tell you that making all neighborhoods equal in terms of socioeconomic backgrounds of the members pushes the government to equally provide for amenities and minimizing desperation among low-income families to commit crimes. It also incentivizes the government to properly fund the authorities in all areas, right? Aside from the fact that it is very much likely redistribution of wealth is much more likely going to happen in our world, due to the fact that when a more diverse income group settles in one neighborhood, it is more likely that the bosses or high executives would be there as well, and they would continue their business and need to outsource from local individuals. And also like secondarily, the coming of amenities means that these individuals would get access to better job opportunities, would get access to like better education, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, even if you say that, our world is not going to succeed because hierarchy would still happen in our world, disparity would still happen in our world, at the very least, we are minimizing those disparity even better in your world, because we ensure a better allocation of resources, as well as ensuring that these individuals don't get deprived of opportunities. Proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite Deputy Leader of Opposition to continue the case for side opposition. Here.
Okay. the expectation that opposition has, that side of government has on the people and private citizens to, one, be okay with the poor living with them, being forcefully moved away from their affluent neighborhoods and into the very same neighborhoods as the people that existing stigma exists against, and the expectation that they will be willing to give you job opportunities and trickle down benefits is simply unrealistic. I have one argument for you today why the imposed exodus of low-income community strips them of their dignity and their rights within these areas. But before that, two things I need to deal with. First, the main concern from the side of government was to say that, one, they would prefer the redistribution of resources, and two, they want to minimize disparity. The first, on redistribution of resources, the position in which side of government must take in this debate is one where they have to justify distributing populations as the best solution possible. All existing measures of things like redistribution, for example, through tax, through poverty outreach programs under like Teach for Malaysia and Architects for Diversity, are things that currently exist. What they needed to do in this debate is defend why all these other mechanisms are insufficient insofar as they try to claim that this is the best mechanism available. The second level to this is to say that oftentimes the best form of redistribution are the ones that are committed willingly. These are voluntary means in which people can contribute to the poor. And we do see people doing this. And in fact, there's an increasing trend at which people do have empathy for the poor. The difference is the forced integration under the side of government is one that is extremely permanent and oftentimes turns people away from helping the poor as a whole. And that's the entire case from side of opposition that I don't think was actually rebutted by sufficiently. The tolerance and empathy that is formed through these kinds of voluntary programs are things that cannot be forced, and more on that later. The second is that the refusal for the side of government to accept that there is some expectation from your neighbors, from like your rich neighbors to help your poor neighbors, ultimately undermines their case a lot. One, if you don't expect some form of interaction or some form of like giving and taking within this community, then what are the benefits of empathy that you achieve under integration from side of government? The second thing is if you don't have any of the expectations to help your poor neighbors, you also wouldn't have community programs like providing them with job opportunities, telling them about people, trying to help them network and stuff like that. All of these benefits are dependent on this expectation existing in the first place, which is why we think it was a principal cop-out for them to say that this doesn't exist at all. Thirdly, we would say that the improvement, even if you have some form of improvement, we will say that it's likely to be stagnant. For one, we talked about the rising living costs in which the poor people have to go to. And it makes logical sense for this to happen because obviously you can't expect rich people to be paying the same prices that they pay in mom and pop shops, because if then it's true, you're just making them excessively rich within these areas as a whole. The disparity doesn't exactly change if you don't take the medium income that Yu Hong told you about that is likely to happen. The second thing is, if this happens, there will come a point where the poor individuals can no longer afford to contribute to community programs. Things like pooling money together as a neighborhood for parks or for better amenities. The point in which you mix rich people, there's an expectation to constantly improve these housing areas. And there will come a point in which the poor people just cannot afford to put in money for this. And the expectation for rich people to fill in then still exists under government in order for you to have better resources to be trickled down towards poor individuals as a whole. Second thing I'll deal with is this idea of minimizing disparity. Number one, DPM rightfully points out that currently a lot of rich people have anti-homeless policies and like things, they often take very big measures to ensure that like their security and stuff like that. What's to say that this measure does not trickle down to the person, to like the poor people, the point in which they're placed in the same neighborhood as you. If you can no longer enact like neighborhood security programs because you don't want to pay for the poor, you will enact private security programs to ensure that you lock out the poor as much as possible, because the existing stigma that the poor will steal and all those things don't change, the point in which there's no empathy in the first place. The forceful reintegration or forceful redistribution makes sure that this thing actually cannot happen. It makes sure that like slow progress of like empathy doesn't happen first before the integration happens. And it assumes that you wouldn't direct all these measures to the poor in the same neighborhood. And we think that's a large problem. Second, on the idea of resources, a side of government seems to be delusioned by this idea that the state can stretch out their resources so much when the poor people are all distributed evenly in different areas. The truth is they can't. A lot of times soup kitchens and welfare centers are centered around specific areas, particularly because we cannot afford spread it out in like every road or every like housing area. The reason why the poor are collectivized at a certain area or like within a geographical location is because it's easy for them to access the benefits that they have as poor people. The reason why you will likely suffer is because soup kitchens will not have the same amount of participation or the same amount of people going to them if they're so outstretched across many different areas. And that applies to a lot of different resources as well. Onto the argument on why the imposed exodus of low-income communities strips them of their dignity and their rights. On the first level, we already concede within, like both houses can agree in this debate that the poor have minimal power and like leverage as tenants in forceful redistribution, okay? The thing is, we will say that the structural difference of comparison under the side of opposition is that when you are in your areas, like when the poor are concentrated in a specific area, poverty is visceral. It becomes harder for you to deny that the slum exists if it's there. If the people are all integrated into pretty decent neighborhoods, it is very easy for the state to deny that this problem actually exists. It's easy for people to say that they no longer have to help the poor because they're so scattered and you actually don't see a very huge number of people suffering. But obviously, the comparative is that the overt discrimination under our side of the house is unlawful. It is things that you can outlaw. It is things you can fine people for. Whereas the implicit discrimination in which side of government has in neighborhoods itself is harder for you to point out for one structural reason. And it's because the avenue of accountability is minimal. With all the sacrifices those around you have made, they feel entitled to your like subservience and your compliance. How dare you complain about the neighborhood after so many sacrifices? How dare you complain about the way in which we talk to you because we've already sacrificed our housing to come live here with you and to try to integrate with you? That kind of mentality reduces the agency in which the poor have to like interact and feel safe within their own homes. And it enhances the ammunition that these individuals have against them. Watching your rich neighbors lament about the difficulties of life, complain about their expensive cars and like amazing food is demeaning and antagonizing for a poor individual, especially when they have to explain to their child why they don't have the same resources.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite Government Whip to continue the case for side government. Here.
Right. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. All right, I'll start my speech in a bit. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In status quo, the government has already sidelined the poor. Why is it that slums still exist? Why is it where, if we already know that the problem is so like in front of us, that there isn't any improvement of the quality of life of the government? Why is it that opposition hinges their case on the reliance of community factors and empathy in order to help alleviate the poverty from the poor? Our case from government is just to illustrate to you that poverty cycles and the structural discrimination that exists between the poor and the rich come from the government in of itself. It's not a bottom-up approach. It's a top-down approach. It existed from the Jim Crow laws eras where the government has already principally unjustly gentrified neighborhoods and put the rich people with the rich and the poor people, which at that time were the African Americans, in poor and badly built neighborhoods in of itself. The government has caused this problem, and thus we believe that it's a principal duty for the government to solve this problem. What am I going to do in today's whip speech? Two things I'm going to do. On the practical harms, I'm going to ask the question, is it true that the resources will actually be efficiently allocated and help alleviate poverty? And on the second one, the pragmatic, the principle, which is like the more like untangible harms, which is safety, which is like helping out this empathy and etc. And we'll weigh it off at the end of this debate. But the first thing I want to point out is opposition has not once proved government's incentives for helping the poor people in status quo, because given that they explain that already, like the government should they push the burden to us that we're supposed to explain that other alternatives aren't beneficial before we move on to this drastic step. I think it's given that status quo there are still multitudes of poor people living in areas where education is subpar to the rich areas, in which where they pay tax money as well because they're citizens of the state, but they don't get the same teachers, they don't get the same public education, public facilities that the rich people get. And this is extremely important. And I have to note why it's extremely important, because the problem is that these structural systems and facilities are the things that make it and break it for these families. The point in which where you send your black child or your poor child to school in a poor slums neighborhood, in which the school is not giving proper education, more likely than not that your student or your poor child is going to drop out of school, is going to not find interest in learning and not pursue higher education, which means that this poverty cycle exists from their parents trying to feed them money and then deciding it's not worth it to send our child to higher education because he's not producing the grades. I don't think he's academically smart. I think he's better to do business or to help us sell nasi lemak at the side of the road. I think that's the more likely charitable characterization in status quo. But moving on to whether resources will be efficiently allocated, I think this is the large chunk of opposition's case. They say things such as like, there's only a set amount of resources and the government will be stretched out to spend those resources on these like on neighborhoods which are already like equal in socio-economic background. While we do agree that now these neighborhoods will be equal in socio-economic background, we disagree that in status quo in of itself there is equal distribution of resources in of itself. We disagree that government has like incentives to make these neighborhoods equal, because we've already explained in my previous speeches, in my members' previous speeches, that the government actually has incentive to cater to the higher economic background where their parents have positions of power, where their parents can leverage decisions by the government, where they pay more taxes, in which then in status quo these neighborhoods are actually like benefited more. So we think that premise is wrong, and that's why we should go with our side. But on the second level, I think these things such as like soup kitchens and geographical aid from NGOs, it's also important to note that these like impacts and these things that and opposition is trying to like state can actually be more localized in our world. The reason being so is because now you have poor neighborhoods and rich neighborhoods converged into a neighborhood, which means that the rich people will have a greater sense, will more likely gain a greater sense of empathy, in which when they see their poor neighborhoods barely being able to feed their children or starving, in which where they feel more empathy to give them food, to actually give them these like make these soup kitchens. And sure, now we're engaging into this idea itself that might be Op's strongest case. This expectation will create like this unfavorable situation for the rich. I think we're willing to trade that off, because note that in both worlds there still is this expectation for the rich to have empathy and donate their money to charity and help out the poor people in one way or another. We're saying that in our world, our interactions between the rich and the poor can become more localized, which means that there will be a greater solidarity between the parties. Moving on to this next point, which is important to clarify as well, which Kina talked in her speech, which hasn't been responded at all by opposition, is about the point of the police brutality and racially discriminating, racially profiling these poor neighborhoods just because the authorities can do that, just because they can. Given that we acknowledge in both sides that these poor neighborhoods in status quo are more likely to have crime rates because of they're locked out of education, they're locked out of these state facilities. But because of that, because of them not having access to these things and them not having access to power and to speak up for themselves, there's more likely chance for these police officers to racially profile these neighborhoods and linger around them further, which means that like in status quo, we see all types of racist incidents that happen where Black lives are being killed every single day. In the comparative world, where we're actually able to have integration, we think that the case that is more likely to happen is that there will be more equal distribution in authorities, in which where if, for example, one neighborhood has an issue, then sure, the authorities will go to that neighborhood. There'll be more efficient responses towards these neighborhoods. I think that's much better for the safety as a whole. But the last response to Op's case about like this thing about like how the rich people would more often than not lock these people out, because they're scared of their safety. I think that's something that we've already engaged with. I think that that's a fair trade-off if that's the worst case. But in the event that sure that there becomes this like structural divide between the rich and the poor, we still think that this sense of empathy that so much argues can be enforced by the mechanisms that happen between having your neighbor as a poor person, seeing them being able to suffer, being able to stride in solidarity for resources as well. I don't think that all human beings are cruel and self-interested. I think human beings have this sense of empathy. And for those reasons, I think that human beings as a whole should have a better economic distribution. Proud to propose.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite Opposition Wade to conclude the case for opposition. Here.
Hello, I'm audible, right?
Yes, you are.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Honestly, at this point, I'm still pretty confused as to what side of government wants, because they keep saying they want to reduce the disparity when it comes to the standard of living of individuals in the country, and they just want to give more welfare to poor communities. Then I don't understand why is there a need to relocate these individuals. Like, why is it so difficult for these governments to take away resources from these rich communities and just like redistribute, or like focus more on slum, like poorly developed areas and develop those areas better? Why is there a need to suddenly move these individuals? And I think a big part of this debate is the sort of interactions which you can get, the point in which you put these individuals in the same vicinity, which I think side of government failed to acknowledge as a big part of this debate, and that's something which is going to harm their case altogether. In my speech, I'll answer 2 questions. Firstly is, when do the lives of poor individuals get better? And secondly, with regards to resource allocation, when is that more effective? So let's take a look at the first thing, right? Like, when do the lives of the poor get better? I think there were 2 main things that were brought up by the side of government. Firstly, with regards to amenities and access to education, for example, and secondly is on this idea of security. I'll touch on both separately. Let's first take a look at amenities and your access to education, etc. So perhaps it is an improvement for the poor, and will, like, the best case for government is that the standard of living is going to get a bit better for the poor. But it also means that it is a downgrade for your higher income groups. Instead of being able to go to rich, privileged prep schools, you now need to go to a more mediocre school, which is probably better for the poor person, but it's definitely worse for the rich person. And this means for richer communities, they would feel that their lives are being downgraded as a result of this policy and feel that they are unfairly treated. Why is this important? Because this means that these sentiments and feeling of being treated unfairly is going to be targeted towards the poor, and that will translate to several things. Firstly is with regards to interactions. This means there'll be more cases of microaggression which poor individuals need to go through and experience in these communities, or even worse, like them being isolated from communal activities or events. Like, for example, if your neighbor has an open house, for example, they're probably not going to invite you because they feel, number one, you don't belong there, you were forcefully put in that environment, and not like, I want you to be my neighbor. And therefore, these sort of sentiments will mean that they are going to be excluded, and there is no solidarity or feeling of community whatsoever within these neighborhoods. This also translates to things like making sure your kids do not interact with like the poorer kids in the neighborhood because you don't want to mix with those type of people. And these sort of sentiments are going to be a lot more prevalent in a world where you force that interaction upon them. But I think a more harmful effect of this sentiment is that these individuals are more likely to lobby against policies that are aimed at poor individuals, the point in which this policy is passed. I think Gov's premise of wanting to like bring the poor into these better communities rather than the other way around, or rather than improving the poor communities, just shows how submissive they are to the rich and how much power these rich communities actually hold in their world. This means like the needs and desires of these rich individuals are more likely to be prioritized when it comes to policy planning and deciding what policy to pass. And that means they're more likely to push against welfare policies, cash handouts to their neighbors, for example, which means that even if they can get improved access to amenities and education, for example, your your improvement is stagnant. This means it's difficult for you to push for anything beyond that and improving the quality of life of these poor individuals, and they are stuck in those circumstances. I think that is a loss on a net. But secondly, is on this idea of security, right? So the problem with government's argument of security is twofold. Firstly, is on this idea of poorly funded police. So I think like they still have to explain as to why this policy is going to immediately mean that all your police forces get better funding, and better funding means they function better. Because I do not think I don't think it's as direct as they imply. Because even if you do equally improve the funding for your police station, it doesn't ensure that the cops are not biased. That it doesn't mean they do not prioritize richer groups. It doesn't mean that racial profiling doesn't happen. Especially when your police force is from the same neighborhood or area, I think this means they're more likely to share these sort of negative sentiments towards these poorer communities. And therefore, even if you have improved access, is a facade from the perspective of a poor person. Because if they call the cops to come to their house, it'll probably take longer than it would for a richer person or for their richer neighbor. And I think that's when the lives of these individuals get worse. I think what's worse than a terrible problem existing is a lie in saying that these situations are actually getting better when in actual fact they do not. But the second problem with regards to this argument of security is that it is dismissive of what drives people to do crime. I do not think that people do crime because like your cops are poorly funded. I think people do crime when they often feel neglected and they distrust the state. And I think that's more likely to happen in a world where you force these individuals into these neighborhoods and tell them your lives are better now, when in actual fact, your lives are not that much better. So I think crime rates are actually going to increase in the world of government, and their argument falls. I think the worst part of all of this is that the poor individuals cannot remove themselves from the situation. The comparative in our world is that if the poor person gets discriminated in the workforce, they don't feel safe outside their home. They hate interacting with people from higher income groups because people just don't understand what they're going through. At least they can go home and feel safe in their neighborhood. At least there's some sense of solidarity because everyone in the slum is suffering, and that suffering is something which they can all relate to. This solidarity which the government claims does not exist in a world where you forcefully push poor individuals into the faces of higher income groups, and therefore that like empathy will never exist in their world. I think in our world, even if we cannot improve their lives and they all become CEOs, at least they can all like have some form of solidarity and comfort in the like four walls of their home. The second question I'll answer is regards to resource allocation and when is it better, right? So this means like welfare and needs-based policies, when can it be better? I think like on a government level, successful policies require people to agree on it because they're taxpayers, but also secondly, feasibility. I think it's a lot more like difficult for you to target your like need-based policies based on like your income, for example, because like they're all spread out more, which means it's harder for you to like identify which geographical location requires more development, which also means that it'll be subpar help to all these neighborhoods rather than like our world where we can focus more funding into that one particular like poorly developed area. Even if you get slightly better quality of life, I think I've already proved to you as to why there's one that is stagnant. But more importantly is like these independent efforts like soup kitchens or training programs and food drives. I think it's more difficult for you to have those efforts because people are more scattered. I think funding is already difficult for these efforts. I think that will be even more difficult because the mid-income and upper class who are required to fund these policies and efforts do not want to do so anymore. I think the government cannot say that the soup kitchen efforts are going to be the same in their side. If anything, it's going to be a lot more difficult because you never prove the empathy to exist. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite opposition reply. Here.
Okay. I have two questions I want to answer in this speech. One, who has a better mechanism of decreasing socioeconomic discrimination? And the second, where do the poor live better lives? But first, I want the panel to note that outside of government's mechanism of the poor moving away from their poor schools, actually doesn't solve the problem. There are still poor people that are going to be in that area. And the point in which the government no longer feels the burden or the immediate need to solve these areas by strategically targeting funding is exactly when those poor areas will likely be worse off. And the reason is because even when you push the richer people there is a possibility for them to opt out. There is always a possibility for the rich to afford better schools or to move towards more expensive schools because they can afford it. And that is the point in which the scattering problem becomes a lot worse, even under the selective paradigm of the school as a resource. On to the first question, how do we decrease socioeconomic discrimination under the side of opposition? We gave you two alternatives. One, we would say the first safety net is government provisions and the active need for governments to provide through the duty of care. And the second, we have the safety nets of NGOs through the exclusive programs in which they help the poor, with targeted measures. The problem in which we told side of government from the very beginning of this debate is that the scattering of these resources makes it very hard for us to ensure that our safety nets are actually very effective. The way in which you open soup kitchens and etc. is very difficult for an NGO to spread out and open so many soup kitchens in the first place when they simply lack funding. Having a concentrated area in which people do have these kinds of needs ensures that the people within those areas have their needs personalized and met. Second thing that they tried to tell us is that their benefits oftentimes rely on trickle down kindness. A lot of the job opportunities that you get, a lot of the introductions to better people, interactions that happen within these areas are things that are based on the benevolence of the rich people within those areas in the first place. I don't think side of government sufficiently proved why the mentality in which people have when moving into these areas, rich people, when they move into these areas, is gonna be one that is very benevolent and very kind towards a poor person, when we've given you structural analysis as to why, one, they're likely to carry forward the resentment that they have over their lives being curbed, their choices being curbed, the point in which they are forced to move within these neighborhoods in the first place. But second, we also said that the point in which you are forced into those areas, it is when the poor are likely to live worse off, cut off because you can't pay. Because you won't be able to afford the communal expenses that are gathered within a neighborhood for better resources like a think and they're preconceived to they think that they are preconceived to steal does not fix the situation at all. And disrupting essentially the support structure in which the poor person had in their original communities. I think that is principally unjust as well. But the worst part of all of this is that the indignity in which the poor feel within these areas is something that they cannot opt out of. When they feel inferior to their neighbors and they feel like they do not belong in the community, a side of government would forcefully try to tell them that this is what integration is like and you have to be okay with this. And the problem with that is that when all the rich people feel like they have done a lot to help the poor, they no longer feel the need to pay more taxes or have more extensive welfare programs because they feel like their burden has been discharged. And in fact, the people that owe them are now the poor that have restricted their choice.
Thank you for that speech. I now invite government reply. Here.
Okay, so I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition believes that the model they propose is functioning. However, we can see how the current world looks like right now, right? And all the inequalities amongst social classes that exists today, right? So what do they tell you? They tell you that our model is not feasible and is likely going to fail. We tell you that the social economic classes are very divided as of currently. Inequality exists in the status quo. We tell you that the relocation, at the very least, would ensure and reduce inaccessibility to resources. We tell you that under their side of the world, they fail to acknowledge the existing problems that we talked about, right? For example, racial discrimination that exists due to these, due to the discrimination and structural discrimination of neighborhoods, also the poverty cycle these poor people are in, right? Which we told you exists in the status quo. They fail to acknowledge how they would even solve these problems under their side of the world, which we can see is not being addressed in the current world today. They tell you that the current measures such as NGOs and etc. are functioning. Then why is it that inequality is so bad? Why is it that minority races are portrayed so badly? It just proves one thing, that these measures aren't simply adequate enough. Even if these NGOs were helping, then what exactly is the government doing to reduce inequality, right? We told you how the government policies place these people in poverty in the first place. And the reallocation is the only way that the government can fix the inequality that they cause in the first place. The only substance that the opposition tells you is that it would cause more disputes amongst the classes under our side of the world, right? Ina told you already how allocations of more security across all neighborhoods is going to, in fact, reduce these disputes and reduce police brutality and cause more empathy. At the very best case scenario for opposition case, like what opposition is suggesting, even if these disputes existed, we believe that it would be very minimal, and the trade-off is that more people would now have access to education. More people can get out of poverty, which itself is the most important factor for this debate. We believe that therefore it is completely justified. They failed to tell you as to why is it that rich people are entitled to more better public resources. Because every citizen is entitled, we told you every citizen is entitled to better public resources, right? It is for all people. So we tell you that it is principally wrong that they believe that rich people are entitled to better public resources. What do we tell you? So to summarize, we told you how important it is to allocate resources to reduce inequality, which would ensure like situations such as which would inherently reduce racial inequalities by ensuring that minorities, specifically racial minorities, have better access to resources. We told you why these problems exist in the first place, right? We told you how Jim Crow's laws in the US actually places individuals, for example, Black people, in poverty in the first place, right? So we told you how racial discrimination further is exacerbated under the current world, under their side of the world. We told you how the government therefore principally owes a duty to its individuals to actually address these problems. I don't see why anyone wouldn't want to reduce police brutality or actually solve these problems. And the trade-off that there would be more dispute is simply not justified. So for all those reasons that I have told you just now, I'm very proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for the speech. Thank you guys for the debate. You guys may cross floor, shake hands virtually, and I think you guys can stay in the room because I don't need to